After Crimea voted to break away from Ukraine and go with Russia, the United States announced this sanction. Really, it's only against 11 Russian and Ukrainian officials. I mean, how is that a deterrent? The targets included ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, key advisors to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and a few more thrown in. The order freezes any assets that these guys have in the U.S. and bans those individuals from entering the country. Were they coming here anyway? President Obama says the sanctions do, however, send a clear signal.
We are imposing sanctions on specific individuals responsible for undermining the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and government of Ukraine. We're making it clear that there are consequences for their actions. Second, I have signed a new executive order that expands the scope of our sanctions. As an initial step, I'm authorizing sanctions on Russian officials, entities operating in the arms sector in Russia, and individuals who provide material support to senior officials of the Russian government.
Okay, so will this get worse? Will it eventually expand to companies and perhaps maybe start to affect U.S. or European companies that do business and have publicly traded stocks? And of course, if you own them and they're in Russia, it may be a problem. Well, our next guest might know. He predicted years ago much of what is happening right now in Ukraine. George Friedman is the founder and chairman of Stratfor. This is a geopolitical intelligence firm. People pay a lot of money for your research, George. I'm glad you're coming on here for free and exclusively from Texas. Thank you for being here, and let's get right to it. These sanctions, did they surprise you as being too light-handed, or are they just right for now?
You're dealing with the 8th largest economy in the world. They can retaliate in all sorts of ways against American sanctions. American oil companies and oil service companies are heavily invested in Russia, have a lot of equipment, have a lot of money there. The United States does not want to start a contest with the Russians over who can hurt who more. So this is about the least they could do and still not appear to be completely ineffective, although they are being completely ineffective.
Well, if we go back to the late 90s, I remember that the Taliban and what was going on in Afghanistan and encouraged the president at the time to say no more doing business with those people. And so Unocal, for example, all the oil companies had to pull out, and whether they did was another story. But right off the bat, are you saying that the U.S. does not want to get into that kind of situation with Russia?
The Russians can retaliate in any number of ways to American sanctions. Second, many of the European countries aren't going to go along with the sanctions, whatever the EU says. So it's kind of one of those symbolic things that makes you sound tough, but in fact you can't use it. But the fact is the United States has won a huge strategic victory in Ukraine by creating a pro-Western government in Kiev. Russia has suffered a tremendous defeat. Ukraine is very strategic to it. The real issue here is, can the Russians allow the Ukrainian government as a pro-Western government to survive? Will they do anything? Where will they do it? It's really not about American sanctions. It's about Russia's next move.
You knew this was coming. In fact, in a book that you wrote in 2009, and we wanted to put the quote up because a lot of people come on and say, I said this was going to happen. You actually did, and it's on the printed page. And you said, in essence, Ukraine's natural economic relationship is with Russia. It relies on Russia for energy, and ultimately it tends to be militarily dominated by Russia as well. The Russians will pull Ukraine into their alliance. This, I believe, will take place by the mid-2010s. Is it happening the way you anticipated it? And does Crimea count? Do they go next for Ukraine?
Crimea is not important. What's important is whether the new Ukrainian government is able to function. We have to remember the Ukrainians are divided among themselves, many different factions. They're not so much pro-Western or pro-Russian as highly confused. So, from the Russian point of view, all they really want in Ukraine is neutrality. They do not want NATO expanding into Ukraine. They don't want the EU expanding into Ukraine. And right now, nobody knows what this government is going to do or be able to do. So the Russians are going to step back and wait for a while. But if this really turns into a pro-Western government that effectively can move toward the West, the Russians are going to have to act. Because, Ukraine is almost as far as Stalingrad, almost as far as the decisive battle.
Act how? Will it simply be using natural gas and the oil reserves that Russia has as a tool or a weapon, or will they move troops in and try and battle this out?
No, they'll try to battle elsewhere. So, for example, they've offered in the past weeks 2 nuclear reactors to the Iranians, and now have offered an oil for food deal. They can really unsettle the United States by working closely with the Iranians, with other Middle Eastern countries.
George,
they also have tremendous influence in the Baltics.
Well, exactly. And you're looking at, well, say, for example, the old white Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I just wonder, because I was looking at the history books, because I'm a geek, and I was watching the American History Heroes channel, rather. March 12th, 1938. Hitler moved in and was welcomed by Austria, just like Crimea, cheered on and welcomed the Russians. But then he took it a step further, went into Czechoslovakia, went into Poland, and we know how that story turned out. Is there a parallel to be made here, or is that too dramatic?
I think it's too dramatic, and you also have to remember that in 1954, Crimea was part of Russia, and Khrushchev carved it off and gave it to Ukraine for various political reasons. This is in the same way as Obama's sanctions are pretty meaningless. This was the least the Russians could do to retaliate. Crimea was pro-Russian. It had heavy Russian forces there ready. Nobody invaded. The game starts now.
And you can see how badly the Russian blue chip stock index, the MISEX, has reacted. He's going to have a bad economy to deal with, too, in answer to his people. George, thank you very much for joining us.